Welcome back, or welcome to this afternoon's session, which is on the future of Iraq and the region. The session will run for about an hour and a half until 2:45. It's a little longer than we anticipated, fortunately, because I think there'll be a lot of discussion. The session will be in two parts. The first part, I will have a conversation with the panelists. And this first part will be on the record. It'll be live streamed, and you can tweet. The second half of the session will be questions from the audience and responses from the panelists. That second half will be off the record, and it will not be live streamed in order to allow for a more open, unrestrained conversation. As I said, you can tweet in the first part, and the Twitter is handle Iraq Initiative. I think that's what it is. I'm not very good at it. I'm also asked to tell you that there is simultaneous translation, English to Arabic. Does anyone need simultaneous translation, English to Arabic? And if so, could you please raise your hand? Nobody? Okay, that takes care of that. Okay. And the final note is, could I please ask you to silence or turn off your phones? Okay. Terrific. So without much ado, let me introduce myself. My name is Arend Al-Rahim. I am the president of the Iraq Foundation. And I'm delighted to host a very distinguished panel. So to my left is Mr. Andrew Peake, and he is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq and Iran in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Hi, Andrew.
How are you?
Yeah. I have next Dr. Sanam Vakil, who is Senior Research Fellow, Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. We're pleased to have again Dr. Laith Kumba, who is a Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister of Iraq. And we have Dr. Abdulaziz Sagar, who is a Chairman of Gulf Research Center in Saudi Arabia. Welcome. So, the way I want to approach this is to ask a question and put it to two panelists, and then ask them to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes. Then I'll ask another question to two other panelists, and again ask them to answer in 5 or 6 minutes. And after that, we'll have a much more flowing conversation with questions addressed to any and all the panelists who want to respond. So, this is about Iraq and the region. And several years ago, there was no Iraq and the region. Several years ago, Iraq was shunned by the region. It was ostracized, and neither did the countries of the GCC, for example, have any appetite to deal with Iraq, nor did Iraq have any wish to deal with those countries either. We have seen a change, quite a dramatic change. We have seen visits by the Prime Minister, by the President, by the Speaker of Parliament, not only in this administration, but also in the previous administration, repeated visits to countries in the Gulf region. There has been a notable rapprochement with Jordan recently, and trade deals and talk of a pipeline. The Prime Minister recently went to Saudi Arabia just after a trip that he made to China, came back to Baghdad, went to Saudi Arabia, then went to Iran, of course, but the important thing is that he also went to Saudi Arabia. And my question really to Andrew and to Dr. Laith is, to what extent is this opening of Iraq and the reciprocal opening of Arab countries in the GCC region a strategic opening and a strategic decision taken by both parties? And is it durable? And has the US played any role in aiding and promoting such a rapprochement? Andrew, could we start with you, please?
Sure, and thank you for being here. This has been a fantastic conference so far, and I am honored to have been invited to the panel, so thank you to Chatham House for putting this on. I have to say, I would classify this portion of the Iraqi government's policy as the execution of normalcy. And let me be clear, I think the Al-Mahdi government has done an exceptional job at rebuilding the ties, normal ties, to its neighboring countries. You referenced a few of these to start off with. Just bringing it back at home for the moment, I would say a signature feature has been the rebuilding post-referendum of ties between Baghdad and Erbil, which the government has done exceptionally well, to include the restarting of oil exports from Kirkuk up through KRG, a tangible mark of reconciliation, and the restoration of what I would think of as normal ties with Saudi, Jordan, Kuwait, and others. Indeed, this capitalizes on many positive strategic trends for Iraq. The challenge for us all as Iraq analysts is, do you focus on those strategic trends, or do you focus on concerning tactical threats? And indeed, I think the trends are positive. Kuwait, for example. On September 15th, the Iraqi government and the GCC Interconnection Authority signed a deal to connect the Basra power grid, where protests nearly brought down the Abadi government last summer, partially due to a lack of electricity, with the GCC power grid, which in 12 months, when that connection is functioning and created, will make life better for Basrawis. In Jordan, you referenced also, there is similar talk of a power connection. There is talk of an oil pipeline. The King of Jordan in January made his first visit to Iraq in something like 10 years. Saudi Arabia is in a similar trajectory, not only due to this government. The Saudi Adel Jaber, made his first trip to Baghdad, first trip by a Saudi foreign minister in 2017, since the Gulf War, the first or second, however you would count it. But this prime minister has really prioritized with the Saudis outreach. He was there with a high-level delegation about 2 or 3 days ago. And on October 15th, we expect the reopening of the Arar border crossing. These are all positive signs between neighboring nations of rebuilding of normal ties, as befits a country, and I think this is the most real takeaway in Iraq when I visit there, that there is a burgeoning sense of normalcy, and there is a political norm protecting it. This norm says, do not push too hard in political competition, do not resort to violence to solve political competition, keep external conflicts out of Iraq, and indeed, it is absolutely US policy to do precisely that. We view our relationship as one of Iraq's key external partners as a bilateral one. We see it in the prism of us and the Iraqis, what we can do to capitalize on the gains post-ISIS and create a more prosperous and sovereign Iraq. We view it through no other lens. That goal of institution building, sovereignty, prosperity, however, is undermined by a number of things. It's undermined by corruption, which just was the focus of a previous breakout panel. It is undermined by 16 years of a semi-chaotic security situation. However, it is also undermined by the fact that other of Iraq's neighbors have more control over, let us say, 30 to 40,000 armed men than the Baghdad government does. And it is Baghdad's ability to manage these competing relationships, not between Iran and the Gulf or Iran and the US, but between normalcy and abnormalcy, that will determine its course in the future. Because the unspoken elephant in the room, or whispered elephant in the room, since it's been mentioned a few times, are the protests that are going on right now in Iraq. And I think what they speak to above all, indeed like the election results last year spoke to, and the riots in Basra, is that Iraqis, young Iraqis, the million or so who come onto the job market every year, want something more than the traditional politics. They want job opportunities. They want responsible security services. They want a country that's prosperous and sovereign and provides a better life for them. And that's what we want also.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd like to throw the same question to Dr. Laith, please.
6 minutes. I'll be brief. And
I said 5.
5 to 6.
6,
I just
okay.
looked under 6.
Okay.
I'll throw several points here. And of course, I agree with Andrew that we mustn't overshadow the moment, and we must look at the trends. And I think the insights you gave on the trends from a US perspective, I'd like to give an insight into the trends from an Iraqi perspective. And from an Iraqi perspective, of course, we're having all sorts of current events at the moment. The important one is, as Iraq restores sense of normality and a sense of stability, any small sense of stability, very quickly it will restore its role in the region. Now, Iraq, the state of Iraq is about, let's say, 90 years old. It had difficulties in finding the right governance constitution to its dynamic nature. Iraq is not, the region is thousands of years old. It has a very strong history in the last 1,000 years. It has direct connections to its neighbors. Its role amongst Arabs and Muslims are very deep and very real and cannot be overshadowed. All this is boxed in within the state of Iraq. And of course, Iraq will have inseparable dynamic and interaction with its neighbors, and it's always been a hard equation. When Iraq became too strong under a dictatorship, it launched 3 wars, one with Iran, one with Kuwait, and of course in the Kurdish region. And of course there has been a worry about a strong Iraq, but the reality is you cannot box Iraq in. When we talk about Iraq, we're not simply talking about the trajectory of the government of Adel Abdel Mahdi. We're not talking simply of the power structure currently. We're talking about a very dynamic country full of promise that cannot be boxed in. So the primary goal, I think, for the Iraqis at this moment is to have stability, because with stability, they can revive their role in the region very quickly. Can it be done? Currently, the challenge is the state is too weak. And because of its inevitable connection to the region, if you look at the long history of Iraq, because it has no, let's say, natural borders, it interacts. It's been invaded a few times. The last 2, let's say, invasions were that of the Allies back in 2003, and the one before that that created the state of Iraq. And both of them had profound impact on the constitution of Iraq. Till now, Iraq has not settled fully. It needs to articulate its role in the region and its role internally. And this is the challenge I think Iraqi elites and educated Iraqis are trying to do. As far as the government of Iraq, of course, they have to work under the current constitution. They have to do their best out of it. In any outlook to Iraq, we cannot separate Iraq from the dynamic of the region. We cannot simply wish it to be a country of no past and to forget about its natural connection to the Arab world, to the Muslim world, and of course to its 2 big neighbors, Turkey and Iran. Both in the last 300 years, Turkey and Iran, at that time the Ottomans and the Safavids, had battles over influencing and controlling Baghdad. And both of them, let's say, have historical perspectives on their relationship to Baghdad. From an Arab and a Muslim point of view, Baghdad is symbolic, not only because of Kufa, the last of the Khilafah al-Rashida, and Baghdad, the last of the Arab Khilafah that was for the Muslim world, but also because still now it has Najaf, it has the shrines of the Sufis. Iraq is too powerful to be, as I said, boxed in or to be under the influence of a country. The real challenge facing Iraqis, currently they are so much bogged down with their internal politics, they are not seeing the potential the country has and the role that it can play. A revival of Iraq and a strong Iraq need not necessarily be a threat to its neighbors and need not necessarily tip the balance. Of course, there will be losers out of a strong Iraq and a strong Baghdad, a re-emergence of Baghdad. But Iraq, hopefully, through a new course and a new phase, can look to a more, let's say, effective way of building ties and bridges to its neighbors. It's facing challenges because its current weakness and the weakness of the state of Iraq. Hopefully that is tackled. It's not easy, it's full of challenges, but hopefully it's tackled. But I do believe Iraq can revive its role in the Arab world and in the region, and its global role, which is most important. Iraq has always, a dynamic in Iraq, we've always been connected to the outside world in multiple ways, not only historically, but even recently. And a revival to Iraq's global connection, not only economically, but even politically, is critical to Iraq. This is the thinking. The challenge is, how do we make it happen in the midst of extremely challenging power structures that are controlling the political scene and are totally, let's say, bogged down with local calculus of power and gains that is based on the moment and not based on a vision. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Laith. Actually, you've sort of allowed me, you're going to allow me to segue very naturally into the next question. But one of the things that is very prominent about Iraq is how many neighbors we have. We have too many neighbors, and the fault lines of the region all converge into Iraq. And when I talk about the fault lines, I'm really talking about a population that is, there's a Shia population, there's a Sunni, there's a Kurdish population, there are Christians, there are linguistic differences within the country, and of course there's Turkoman and so on. And all these fault lines, in a way, both connect Iraq to the rest of the region, but also expose Iraq, put Iraq at risk within the region. And a lot depends on the ability of a government centrally to turn those into advantages and opportunities rather than liabilities. So that takes me to the next question, and I'd like Dr. Sanam and Dr. Abdelaziz to answer it, which is, let me just start with something. President Barham Saleh recently suggested convening a regional conference specifically targeting Gulf countries and Jordan and so on, convening a conference in Baghdad to assist in the stabilization of Iraq, to assist in the reconstruction of Iraq, to think strategically about the relationship or the position of Iraq within that region. Now, the question is, first of all, the Gulf countries have been, for the most part, very responsive. Certainly Jordan has been, Saudi Arabia has been. Relations with Kuwait have been on and off. I mean, they hosted a huge conference to pledge aid to Iraq, but at the same time, about a month ago, certainly several weeks ago, there was an issue of water frontiers and so on. So, but on the whole, the Arab countries have been very responsive. And my question to the two panelists is, are the Gulf countries being responsive to Iraq's overtures because they really think Iraq is a valuable member of the region? Is it because they have suddenly realized that they must make friends with Iraq or befriend Iraq and help Iraq because otherwise, because they're a counterbalance to Iran. And without their presence, Iran will certainly fill the vacuum. Or is it perhaps a fear that if they do not get involved with Iraq, then a stronger Iraq, which might emerge, is going to be hostile? What are the motivations of Gulf countries in engaging with Iraq and opening the doors and allowing this rapprochement to flourish? What's driving that?
Dr. Abdulaziz, no, please.
She wants you first.
Me first on the Gulf? Okay. Well, I definitely think that the Iranian dynamic is a big driver of that engagement. I think it is, unfortunately, a reactive and defensive driver, and it shouldn't be the motivation for Gulf engagement in Iraq. Because should not be the motivation to contain Iran. And I will explain why in a second. I think it shouldn't be really because Iran is a very opportunistic and effective player as a regional actor, and it capitalizes on weak states, crises in the region in a very effective way. And we have seen the Islamic Republic implement very strategically over a number of decades now a policy that is not necessarily been planned, but I think has been replicated throughout the region and also in Iraq, that has allowed it to burrow itself, for lack of a better word, into Iraq in a formal and an informal way. And it's done it at a political, institutional level. It's done it at an economic level, where you have interaction with the Iranian state entities and bonyads, but also informally with the private sector. You have it through soft power, through the spread of Iranian universities, through the spread of media, through the religious ties. And then you have, of course, the very obvious and the very well-known military relationships that are, again, formal and informal, institutional and non-state based. And this policy is quite refined at this point. And we know now, effectively, that Iran's policy is not purely sectarian. It is diversified, it is strategic, it is multifaceted, and it is about managing and protecting what Iran is ultimately seeking, the security and stability of the Islamic Republic. So in the context of how Iran manages its relationship with Iraq, and I think with other countries in the region, the Gulf shouldn't be engaging in what to me seems a very long-term strategic relationship with Iran's neighbors, but rather should develop its own strategic, diplomatic, economic, and cultural ties that would benefit the Gulf and would benefit the region itself.
And Iraq.
And Iraq. Yeah, primarily Iraq, but also the Gulf. Eroding Iranian ties in Iraq aren't going to happen overnight. And I think everyone is constantly looking for that quick fix, whether it's the grid binding Iraq to the GCC grid. Okay, maybe that it will eventually lead to something, but it's not going to lead to something immediately. Whether it's the smuggling across the Iranian border, whether it's the influence of the soft power, the media, the 3 million pilgrims that are going to come through if the borders open for Arba'in, all of this is very hard to roll back. So there has to be a bit more of a strategic plan in this engagement.
So what you're saying is the Gulf countries should not try to erase or undermine, but to act as a counterpoise.
Absolutely. And ultimately, I mean, whether it's the Arab Gulf countries or Iraq or Iran, I mean, the principal issues remain the same around the region. Governance, employment, anti-corruption are dominant themes that are driving domestic politics across the Middle East writ large, but specifically in the Gulf and Iran and Iraq. So there are opportunities, I think, also to move beyond this discourse of containing Iran, sanctioning Iran, and finding common ground. And it's clear, I think, from my perspective and my work on Iran, that containing Iran has not been effective as a regional strategy, has not been effective as an Arab Gulf strategy. So using Iraq as sort of the playground for that strategy isn't going to build goodwill for the Gulf states.
Let's see what Dr. Abdulaziz has to say about this.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that during the 1980s, the regional security was based in Iraq plus GCC country, offsetting the Iran desire for hegemony and expansion of revolution in the region. Now, situation have changed today. If you look at how does the Gulf perceive the situation in Iraq, they look at it as a sort of a potential danger for the obvious reason. Lack of strong central government influence over the whole country, the unification of Iraq, the issue of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They have not disappeared totally. They still have some sort of presence. The lack of stability, security vacuum in Iraq. All these issues makes it a potential danger for the region. So they're not getting the benefit as of today, you know, when they look at Iraq's situation on the current situation. However, Iraq, part of the region, definitely enjoy a large border with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, more than 1,000 kilometer border. Situation in Iraq will have negative or positive impact in Saudi Arabia. The late Prince Saud al-Faisal in 2004 in a Manama dialogue, he said, we need to have a safe Iraq and a friendly Iran and a prosper Yemen. That was the difficult equation to bring, but at the same time, I think we're still looking for Iraq. I mean, they are our neighbor, they are our brothers. We have a long tribal family relation linkage to Iraq that we would like to see an important relation. Unfortunately, in 2003, 2004, the presence of Saudi Arabia in Iraq was perceived wrongly. And some people, they thought that the field hospital was created by the Saudi government to help you know, the need of the people, that this is our Wahhabi center, which was not the true. In 2007, 2008, we heard from our American friends saying, we would like to see a constructive Saudi engagement in Iraq. Now, after all the border was open for Iran and allow Iran to have a, you know, massive spheres of influence inside Iraq, was very difficult to reposition ourselves. Unfortunately, since 1990, most of the Gulf country has a little presence in Iraq, and to regain that position, to do it and to help and to open things, I think we have seen, you know, the regular visit, of course, you know, coming from Iraq to Saudi Arabia. President Barham Saleh, I think he did more than twice now. You know, Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi, we have seen the exchange. And I can tell you a secret. I was the one who in 2004 said we need to have a border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, not a free zone, we call it a depository place where the Iraqi businessman can come and buy goods from there, take it back Iraq without going through a lot of difficulties. But due to the security situation in Iraq at that time was very difficult. However, I'm happy today to see it, and I'm happy to see that the linkage through the grid, you know, for the electricity requirement, right, because there's the two big transformer in Zubair and in Basra that can be linked with the Gulf, you know, grid, and many of the electricity could be supplied. For us, Iraq security situation, we need to have a safe Iraq. We need to have Iraq that reduce the external spheres of influence. We know Turkey is demanding, Iran is demanding, the Gulf country also, right, and the U.S. also. The U.S., you know, they have a very strong role, and very important. The Europeans have also a very strong and important role in Iraq, but that needs to be balanced with the region. In other words, we don't want Iraq to be a platform for the external power, but at the same time, we want Iraq to be part of the region. You know, there were many organizations on the industrial, on the health, on the education, where Iraq used to be a member with GCC on those organizations, regional organizations. So we would still like to see Iraq back again to the region, having much more closer relation and a friendly relation with Iran. But we don't want an Iranian hegemony inside Iraq. We would like to see a friendly relation with Iran because they have been in a long war, and it's understandable how the Iranians feel about the situation in Iraq. But we do not wish to see that sort of hegemony and the impact on the people. Of course, when we talk about the militia and their role in Iraq and how that represents a threat to a Saudi border of 860 kilometers, there is a threat, and we feel, we need the central government to take more control and to deal with many of these issues domestically there.
Thank you. Well, we're talking about the region. And so the region is more than the GCC, with all due respect. The region also includes Iran and includes Turkey and so on. But recently at the UN General Assembly meetings, Secretary of State Pompeo convened a meeting with Iraq and the GCC and Jordan. And in at least some media, this was sort of seen as a convening a kind of an anti-Iran axis. And there was, it was a bit controversial having Iraq and Iraq's president in there, and raised a lot of speculation. So is this opening of Iraq to the Gulf and the reciprocal opening of the Gulf to Iraq somehow manipulated or orchestrated, let's say, by the U.S.? Is it something that the U.S. is putting together, is shaping, or not? Let's start with Andrew.
So the short answer to are we manipulating the Iraq is no. No, I think it is mutually beneficial. I think that is why Iraq attended what we would call a GCC +2 meeting, GCC plus Jordan and Iraq. The things that Iraqis want can be provided by the international community. Foreign direct investment, you alluded to the unemployment issue, which is very, very real. Foreign direct investment, closer links with the international community, closer links with development organizations like the IMF. And there are not that many paths to the entree to those. Iran is not that path. Iran is the entree to a different development path, quote unquote, right? A different kind of state model. But that state model is not going to give any help to Iraqis on the streets today.
Sorry, Andrew, I'd like to bounce this question.
I thought it was another 5 minutes.
No. I'd like to bounce this question to anybody else on the panel. Maybe Dr. Lathers. It's good to.
Thank you for the remarks you've made. Let me give you an insight. And as I said, it's consistent with, I think, a message I'm trying to say. Iraq, of course, is much bigger than its government and what's happening at a small scale. But Iraq currently and its state is not at its strongest point. It is really, really trying to pull itself together. Let me give you a concrete example, since we've talked about Iran, let's say the neighbor with the strongest influence inside Iraq. I've asked senior officials, without naming their positions within Iraq, 3 simple questions, and this will give you an insight. Question 1, do you think Iran has a clear, strong strategy on Iraq? The answer is yes. And again, different parts of Iraq or different political groups have different views. And the second question is, do you have a clear understanding of their strategy? And there was an ambiguity. But the third one, which was the most important thing, do you think Iraq has a clear strategy on Iran? And again, there was silence. And to me, that sums up on such an important issue. Iraq has not yet formulated a clear strategy on this challenge. And of course, this goes then to the Gulf states, to the opportunities that are opened up when there are let's say, conflicting agendas in the region, that gives Iraq an opportunity to advance its agenda, which is not taking place. Iraq's history, everybody knows, back in the 50s, when there was a strong competition in the region between the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc, Iraq joined the Baghdad Alliance Pact, Baghdad Pact, where it had Turkey and Iran, two strong states, and protecting itself from the influences of those two states by being in a pact with them where they are part of a regional security. So there are strong, serious questions about Iraq's role, its security, and its internal affairs. But the state of Iraq, I wouldn't say just the government or the foreign minister, but I think the state really needs to consolidate itself before we can advance in the region. Iraq can, at the moment, be a playground for various forces, but it cannot sustain that for long. It has to revive its role.
I'm about to ask that question, but I think Dr. Sanam wants to respond to the U.S., I won't call it manipulation, but orchestration. Is there U.S. orchestration? And
yes, I'll give my short answer, which is yes.
Okay.
In absence of an effective strategy to unravel Iran's influence, which again I described as being, informal and multifaceted and really sort of getting inside multiple weak states, the U.S. government doesn't have a plan for dealing with Iran in the region. And ultimately, the main problem I see is that the region doesn't have a plan for Iran. The region has relied and outsourced and hoped that U.S. policy would be effective to contain Iran, sanction Iran, encircle Iran, and it hasn't worked. It's official. We have to acknowledge that. And so we have to think of what the new policy is going to be.
Well, I think Iraq is part of the equation, cannot be excluded from any arrangement there in the region. Talking about Iran, I listened very carefully to the speech delivered by President Rouhani at the United Nations, and I think I was extremely impressed when he said regional security should be based in non-interventionist and non-aggression. I will add one part to that one. I need a UN guarantor to see that this principle is being implemented correctly, because what we are suffering today from is Iran using sectarianism as a dimension to expand their spheres of influence in the region. If he is in support of non-interventionist and non-aggression, we would love that, and we would love to be the first signatory to it as a Saudi Arabia. If there will be a guarantor, a United Nations guarantee of the implementation, the process, how is that going to be implemented?
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a somewhat different topic, but not that different, and that is, now I have to choose my words carefully because of Andrew. The competition between Iran and the U.S. and Iraq, and the awkward position that the government of Iraq finds itself between those two powers, and the requirement or the pressure on the Iraqi government that's brought to bear on by Iran and by the US, and the Iraqi government's efforts to walk a tightrope, to keep a balance of those pressures and of those competing interests. First of all, will either side, will the US or Iran, accept for Iraq, agree for Iraq to maintain that balance? Is that balance sustainable? And are there conditions that are required for it to be sustainable? Or is the balance unsustainable, it will not be allowed to happen, and that conditions will cause it to fail? So this balancing act that the Iraqi government, I mean, the Prime Minister has spoken about it, President Barham Saleh has spoken about it, the Speaker of Parliament, all three leaderships have spoken about Iraq being a neutral zone between the competing interests of the US and Iran in Iraq. Okay. Could we start, let's start in reverse. We're not going to start with you. We start with Dr. Abdulaziz.
Well, to have Iraq as a neutral?
Whether Iraq can be neutral in this competition.
Giving all the Iraq neighborhood countries, I think it's not easy to maintain that sort of situation unless they are supported by the region. I remember after 2003, we used to have Iraqi neighborhood meetings, which was very useful to have all the neighborhood of country of Iraq meeting organized to discuss issue between the neighborhood country and Iraq. If we have that back into place, Iraq and the neighborhood, where we discuss the issue related from each different angle, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and then Turkey, is very important because these are the big neighborhood for Iraq. We need to have a safe Iraq, as I said. We need to have Iraq focusing in its own domestic politics issue. Iraq is important as a member in OPEC and a large oil producer, so it's very important for the region and for the big neighborhood there. Iraq is important because they are a buffer zone for us between the Arab country and Iran. So we need to have a friendly situation between Iraq and Iran, not to enter into a new conflict. But at the same time, we need to have a strong domestic capability in the Iraqi government to be able to handle, to keep Iraq united. It's neither in the Saudi, neither Iranian interest to have a fragmented Iraq. We wanted to have a unified Iraq, that has a central government with regional also, government can work together with the federal system that exists today in Iraq. But, build what I call Iraqi notion of nationalism. That's what we need there in Iraq to have.
Dr. Laith, this balancing act between the competing interests of the US and Iran, I mean, as the tensions have risen, it has become very difficult for the Iraqi government to walk that tightrope.
I'll be frank, and I speak my own personal views. As I said, I'm not representing anybody but myself. I think there was a balance that was maintained from 2003 till 2018, where indirectly those two strong forces had a say on how things were going. I think that balance was broken in 2018, and I think that has tilted.
Could you say why and how?
That would be more difficult to speculate why, but certainly let's say the new US administration and the projection of its messages had, let's say, had all the alarms set up from an Iranian perspective that there is no room for that. And I think the balance tilted. This is my, again, personal analysis. So Iraq now faces a new challenge by which Iran's security is threatened, and they're reacting by accelerating their influence in Iraq. I think they had a gradual build-up quietly of influence before, but it has now gone on a slightly accelerated track. So this is the influence, anybody in Iraq, I mean, the formality of a government is totally there, a sovereign and no interference and all Iraqi decisions. But the reality, again, I speak frankly because one has to define a problem before trying to respond to it in a responsible way. So Iraq has that challenge today, and it's struggling to make sure that there is stability and security in Iraq. There should be no violence. Iraq benefits far more from stability and security than from just reacting to, let's say, short-term agendas. And of course, the Iran's agenda and the US agenda ultimately will be different from the Iraq agenda. And Iraq has a challenge to formulate its national agenda while at the same time trying to keep those two competing forces in the region, let's say, at bay and not really undermining Iraq. Ideally, Iraq should benefit from such conflicting agendas. It's a challenge for the Iraqi government to do it.
So it's a challenge to maintain that balance and that neutrality.
Absolutely.
And this has become a greater challenge
Yes.
after 2018. And I presume that we can all think about the withdrawal of the US from the JCPOA as being at least one of the triggers for this tilt or this changing dynamic inside Iraq. Would you say so?
I would not comment on that.
Okay, all right. Okay. Sanam, could you?
I will comment. I think there is a direct correlation between Iran's increased regional activity and the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. And with the withdrawal being designed to reduce Iran's influence, I think we can very much see the opposite effect with Iran using limited cards. I mean, it doesn't have a big hand. It's not a huge, strong hand to play, but playing a spoiler role in the region and trying to escalate tensions as a means of pressuring the United States through regional actors is part of Iran's strategy. It is also part of Iran's strategy to project its power and influence, demonstrate that it is still there, resistance remains strong, and ultimately, even though there have been periods of coexistence between the United States and Iraq, and I very much agree with Dr. Laith, ultimately what Iran seeks is the removal of the United States in the region, and it sees that as a reality that is coming to the region. So regardless of how long maximum pressure stands, Iran sees itself to benefit from the current U.S. policy because it's going to be there at the end.
I suppose I would dispute the premise of your question. It is not whether Iraq can balance between Iran and the U.S., but what does Iraq want to look like in the future? Because in the wake of a post-crisis environment, which is where we are now, post the defeat of ISIS, the things that are topmost priority for the Iraqis cannot be achieved by tolerating the level of abnormal behavior in Iraq that Iran exerts, the 30 to 40,000 armed men, the dumped gas, the overpriced electricity. These are the sort of hallmarks of an abnormal relationship, and they make that countries with foreign direct investment and access and entree to international institutions go away and not want to be there. And ultimately, that won't serve the government of Iraq, and I think the government of Iraq knows that.
Thank you. I want to spend the last few minutes on an issue which has been coming up this summer and hints of it. It sort of it relates actually to the fact that Iraq has many challenges, but also Iraq represents a crossroads of many of the interests in the area, the population, the languages, the common tribes that Dr. Abdulaziz referred to. In other words, Iraq is very interconnected with the region, and we spoke about that as being a challenge, but also something that can be turned into an opportunity. And this came up, I think, last August, when there were rumors that Iraq would mediate with Iran over the seizure of a British tanker. I've forgotten its name. And the Prime Minister went to Tehran and not immediately, but in fact not immediately at all, but quite a while later there was talk about his, about the release of the tanker, and there was talk about his mediation or Iraq's mediation. More recently, the Prime Minister made a long speech after going to Saudi Arabia, talking explicitly about Iraq's role as a peacemaker, a mediator in the region. And there was sort of hints that he went from Saudi Arabia to Iran, if I remember rightly, and there were hints that there was some kind of mediation over Yemen. Okay. My question to the panel is this: is it realistic for Iraq, with the weak or weakened state that it has, Dr. Laith so well expressed to us, and can it be a mediator? Is it merely a messenger, just sort of transferring messages from one country to the other? Does it have the clout to actually propose solutions and to see them through? Or is this sort of pipe dreams? Is this something very much in the future, but that the leadership, current Iraqi leadership, would like to capitalize on it now? What is the truth about Iraq's ability to become a mediator in the region? Andrew, can we start with you, reversely?
I was trying to prompt you to go to the... You know, we accept that Iraq will have a different relationship with Iran than the United States does, or perhaps Saudi Arabia does, or that Turkey does, or other countries in the region. Our policy, our sanctions are not designed to stop Iran's influence in Iraq or stop Iraqi trade with Iran. That would be preposterous. It is to restore the normality in that relationship, to make sure that when Iraqis buy things from Iran, that they do so of their own free will. They don't do so because they're coerced not to, or coerced to, I suppose, that their political system is not subverted. This restoration, full restoration, as Dr. Laith alluded to, of sovereignty and the sustainment of this sovereignty, I suspect, from my point of view, will occupy all of Iraq's, much of Iraq's, democratic and official bandwidth in terms of managing Iranian currents.
Thank you. Can I roll this down?
Yes.
Sanam?
I think it's quite strategically challenging to put it delicately. I think that Iraq can play the role of the messenger, and it has, and I think it should going forward. But I think that to avoid too much pressure in this dynamic, I wouldn't think that in this moment where there are governance challenges, I don't think that that's something that Iraq should be maybe advocating. And I think at the same time, it would be important to not just overstate the Iranian relationship as being wholly positive. I'm not trying to sell that message here. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that on the Iranian side of the border, there are also frustrations about the dynamics, frustrations about the relationship, frustrations about Iran's, I don't know, selling the better potatoes in Iraq than in Iran. These sort of things that complicate the relationship.
Can I ask Dr. Abdelaziz, in 1 minute, and then Dr. Laith in 1 minute. Please start.
Well, Saudi Arabia, they were always open, to welcome any sort of mediation with Iran, particularly when it started a year and a half by the Emir of Kuwait. And just guess what? After the GCC, get their act together, and they were willing to welcome, after Rouhani letter to the Emir of Kuwait, we find out the biggest terrorist cells in Kuwait were established by the Iranian. So the question is, the Iranian says that 10 years of negotiation on the JCPOA did not work with the European. 2 years after we had the approval of the Murshid al-A'la, then it was endorsed, and then we had an agreement with the US. So they understand that the US role need to be direct, one-to-one. However, they're still sticking to their clear instruction now today, which is remove the sanction before we can have direct talk. I think if I go back to 1988 when Khomeini said, تجرعت السم, I had to swallow the poison to accept ending the war with Iraq. Iran is not yet at this stage. They have been able to deal with the suffering, with the sanction, with a lot of this at this moment. However, is that going to continue for a month or two? Their frustration, I think, have resulted to attacking the Saudi oil platform in the two different ones, because for a year and a half they said since President Trump 12 condition came out, clearly against Iran, and the sanctions have been scrutinizing, they find themselves, they need to find a way. Iran feels a security loneliness, which is, obvious because of the threat in the region. But at the same time, I think we need to deal with the situation in a negotiated basis. We need to have a balance. We need to have a wisdom. We need to have a signal from both sides. And I'm very pleased to see both sides saying, we don't mind meeting with each other. We don't mind talking to each other. But let's hope for the best.
Dr. Laith, is Iraq a credible mediator? Can it be at this stage?
No question it has the potential. Currently, again, because of that, let's say, moment of weakness, it hasn't realized its potential. Just bear in mind the three, let's say, major populations or power centers, be it the Kurds or the Arab Sunnis or the Shias in general, they can be leverages to play a role in mediation because they have their own legitimate, strong channels in the region. Currently, Baghdad is weak, but Iraq has lots of cards. Don't forget, Najaf has influence over Iran, and that is totally unrealized. Also, the strong Kurdish region has a projected influence over Iran and Turkey. There are actually many cards Iraq can realize and can play, but currently it's underplaying its potential.
Thank you. Thank you. This is it's more than a half, I'm sorry. But at this point, we're going to take questions, and we will not be live streamed. This will be off the record, Chatham House rules. And please, if there's any press, would you respect the rules that we're laying forward? So, absolutely.